Tax Samaritans video series. If you've been residing overseas, outside of the United States, this video will help you understand your U.S. income tax filing requirements and whether you're required to file a tax return. The first question to ask is to determine whether you were a U.S. citizen as of the last day of the tax year, which is generally December 31st. So you are considered a U.S. citizen, irrespective of whether you have a U.S. passport or Social Security number, if you were born in the U.S., or if one of your parents were a U.S. citizen. In addition, you may also become a naturalized U.S. citizen. If you're a U.S. citizen, you may have a U.S. tax filing requirement if your worldwide income meets the thresholds for tax reporting. If you are not a U.S. citizen, the next question to ask is whether you're considered a U.S. resident alien for tax purposes. You are considered a U.S. resident alien if you either 1. Have a green card, 2. Meet the substantial presence test, 3. Or you're married to a U.S. citizen or resident alien and you have elected to be treated as a U.S. resident alien. If you are a lawful permanent resident or green card holder at any point during the calendar year, then you're a U.S. resident alien for tax purposes. This holds true even if your green card has expired. You're still considered a green card holder until formally renouncing your green card. If you don't meet the green card test, you must use the substantial presence test to see if you're considered a U.S. resident alien. The substantial presence test is met if you were in the U.S. at least 31 days during the tax year and at least 183 days during the most recent 3-year period, which includes the tax year in question and the 2 prior tax years. The 183-day criteria is determined by counting all the days in the current year and 1/3 of the days in the most recent prior year and 1/6 of the days in the prior year before that. If you don't meet either the green card test or substantial presence test, a special election could be made for the tax year, or it may have been made in the prior year for the non-resident spouse to be treated as a U.S. resident. A joint income tax return must be filed with your spouse, who is a U.S. citizen or resident alien, in order to make this election. By making this election, both you and your spouse will be taxed on worldwide income, and the non-resident spouse will be treated in the same way as a citizen for tax purposes. If you are a U.S. citizen or resident alien, you must file a U.S. tax return to report your worldwide income, regardless of your residence, whether you're living in the U.S. or outside of the U.S., if your income meets the filing threshold amount. The filing requirement threshold for a federal tax return is generally determined based on your income, age, and filing status. The threshold amounts are adjusted and published on an annual basis based on these factors. On this slide, you can see the 2014 filing requirements chart that applies for most taxpayers. It lists the filing threshold amount for gross income based on filing status and age. Using the chart, if you are married filing jointly and both spouses are under age 65, then a return would need to be filed in 2014 if your gross income was at least $20,300. In other words, $20,300 or more. As indicated by the title of the chart, filing requirements for most taxpayers, there are always exceptions to the rule when it comes to U.S. taxes, which can further complicate matters. There are other situations where a tax return may still be required, even if your gross income is below the filing threshold. For example, if your net earnings from self-employment were at least $400, then a tax return would still be required to be filed. So you may be asking the question, what happens if I'm not a U.S. citizen and not a U.S. resident alien? What then? Well, if you've received U.S. source income during the tax year, you may still be required to file a tax return, known as a non-resident alien income tax return, which is filed on the Form 1040-NR. U.S. source income can take many forms, such as income from companies owned in the U.S., rental income on U.S. property, and income received for services performed in the U.S. If all three of the following statements are true, that you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not a U.S. resident alien, and you have no U.S. source income, then you probably are not required to file a U.S. tax return. If you need help with determining your U.S. income tax return filing requirements, please feel free to contact us at Tax Samaritan by calling 702-350-1040 or email us at info@taxsamaritan.com.